Hey there, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is Rachel Gregory, your host, and today is a solo recording where I'm going to be jumping in to an update on my cut or my fat loss phase, whatever you want to call it. So I posted a question box on my Instagram story about a week ago where I asked if anybody had any questions that they wanted to ask me about, how the cut's going, or anything kind of in general related to going on a cut or going into a fat loss phase. And I got a bunch of great questions. So I'm excited to jump into those today and also give you an update on how things are going. So before we jump in, just a quick reminder, if you haven't already, please go over to iTunes and leave a rating and review. That really, again, it helps to spread the word about the show. It helps to get us ranking higher so more people can see the show and listen to it. And it really, really helps more than you know. So if you haven't done that, please head over to iTunes. You can just leave a 5-star review, hopefully, or 5-star rating, hopefully, and a quick review, just a few sentences about what you like about the show, or anything like that. It would really, really help. All right, let's jump into the update and dive into the questions that we have for today's episode. All right, so jumping into the update for what's been going on the past few months. So I started my fat loss phase back on March 8th, 2021. So that was the first week. And I'm recording this right now on May 12th, 2021. So it's been about 2 months, specifically about 9 weeks since I officially started. Before that, if you haven't listened to any of the episodes recently, I was in a building phase for 8 months. So I was in a surplus. I was pushing muscle gain and obviously some fat gain came along with that. And I gained about 15 pounds over that 8-month period. It was a great experience. I chatted all about that in a previous episode. Forgot exactly what number that episode was, but I will link that in the show notes. And just so you know, I'm going to be linking a bunch of previous episodes in the show notes today, just to reference back to those based off of some of the questions I got. So definitely check out the show notes if you haven't. If you're listening to this on iTunes, you can swipe up and you'll see the timestamps and links within the show notes. If you're listening to this on a different platform, or if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll also be able to view those there. Or you can go to my website and view this episode on the blog post. There's all the show notes are up there with all the links. So anyway, let's get back into it. So I started the cut March 8th after coming off of an 8-month building phase. And like I said, it's been about 9 weeks. So when I first started, I started with obviously cut down for maintenance, or implemented a deficit for maintenance, right? So I was in a slight surplus, and then I spent about a week to 2 weeks around maintenance intake, and then we started the cut and dropped calories a bit. I'm going to get into the specifics there in a second when I go over some questions, because I did have specific questions in terms of what percentage deficit I started at and where I'm at now. So I'll get into the specifics of those in a few minutes. But I did start with a linear approach, which means I started consuming about 7 days a week. I was consuming the same amount of calories each day. And then after about 2 to 3, I think it was week 2 or week 3, I decided to kind of lean into some calorie cycling methods that I've used in the past for past fat loss phases that I've known have worked for me in terms of helping with adherence. So after about 2 to 3 weeks of a linear intake, I talked to my coach and we switched things up a little bit and implemented some strategies that I talked about in the past on this podcast. So incorporating a PSMF day each week, and then also incorporating a refeed day each week. So if you don't know what PSMF days are, I'm not going to dive too deep into them today, but they do stand for protein sparing modified fast days. And so I actually recorded an episode all about PSMF with my good friend Robert Sykes. And that episode is actually going to be airing next week. So if you're listening to this, just if you're listening to this on the day of the release, stay tuned for next week's episode. It's going to be episode 114, where we're chatting all about PSMF days. That is a deep dive into what they are, how I implement them with myself and with my clients, the positives, the negatives, all that jazz. So stay tuned for that. But I have implemented PSMF days for myself in the past, over the past 3-ish years of the different cycles that I've gone through. I've implemented them with a lot of clients, and I've had a lot of success with them. For me personally, they're just, and for all my clients, they're just an adherence tool, a weekly adherence tool. So I found that I have a lot of success with implementing one PSMF day per week when I'm in a fat loss phase, because it allows me to allocate more calories to another day of the week. So basically what my approach has been since the third week of this cut up until now has been about 5 days per week I'm at a specific caloric intake. 1 day per week I'm at a PSMF day, which is a lower calorie day, really focused on just protein. And then another day per week is a refeed day where I bump calories back up. And it really is just all about adherence. So there's no magic behind calorie cycling. Really, the goal is to end the week where I want to be in terms of my weekly caloric intake. Dividing those calories up within the week, it doesn't really matter how you do that. The biggest key is just finding what works with your lifestyle and what you can adhere to. For me, over this cut and right now, doing 5 days a week in a deficit, 1 day a week in a little bit more of an aggressive deficit, which would be that PSMF day, and then 1 day a week where it's a refeed day where basically calories are coming back up to maintenance. That works really well for me. Specifically because I like to have more freedom on Saturdays. I like to go out to dinner, I enjoy trying new restaurants around the San Diego area where I live. There's tons of restaurants and good food. So that works into my lifestyle, and I've gotten great results doing it. And it's helped with adherence for me personally. So I've been leaning into that and following that calorie cycling approach for the past, I would say, 6-ish weeks. So that's kind of the approach. In terms of updates with body composition and with the scale. So the scale has been pretty interesting this cut. It's been really sticky in the sense that it's the first, I guess, like month or so, it was just really kind of staying around the same. I was staying around the same kind of weekly average, dropping a little bit, but the scale was jumping up at weird times. And it was just like, it's one of the reasons why the scale is not the end all be all. And this is something that I preach to my clients and I have to continuously remind myself about as well. It is just one metric. It's just one data point, or it's just one set of data that we're looking at. We want to look at obviously all the other things as well. So measurements, how I'm feeling, how my clothes are fitting, all of that. And so the fact that I'm aware of that and I know that the scale is not the end all be all, that helps me kind of get through and helped me get through the days where the scale might have jumped back up to like a weird, crazy number that I wouldn't expect, right? And I'll talk about that in a second when I get into specific numbers, but the scale was a little bit sticky. The first, I would say 4 to 6 weeks, really over the past 3 weeks is really when I've seen, or at least seen the data kind of shift a little bit in terms of looking back at the weekly averages and things like that, which is another huge piece of it. You cannot look at the single data points of the scale on a day-to-day basis. You have to look at the weekly averages, the biweekly averages, the trends, even the trends over the months is really what's important. So I'm going to kind of get into a few of those numbers here so you can get an idea of that. But just so you kind of see where I'm at now. So I started at about a high of I'm looking at my data tracker here, it was a high of 145.4. So that was my high going into the cut. The first week of the cut, let me look here. Yeah, 145.4 was the Tuesday when I first started the cut. And then my weekly average after the first week was about 144 or 140. Yeah, 144. So that was a high. I started at 145.4 and I hit a low last week of 137.6. Okay. So just kind of keep those numbers in mind. I went from a high of 145.4 to a low of 137.6 a few days ago. So the reason why I want to talk about this a little bit is because weekly averages are what matter, like I mentioned, and the trends are what matter, not the data points. So I'm probably down about a solid 5 pounds. I'm probably closer to 6 after this week's weekly average. But just talking about kind of the goal of, looking at the scale when I first started the cut, the goal was to lose on average about 0.5 to 0.75% of my body weight per week, which for me came out to about 0.7 to 1 pound per week loss. So if we go towards the lower end of that for the weeks that I've been in the deficit, which has been about 8 weeks, and I'll talk about why it's 8 weeks, not why 9 weeks in a second, you would just multiply that 0.7 times 8 weeks, which gets us to about 5.6 pounds. And I'm coming in right around there. By the end of this week, I'll probably be around that 5.5 pound mark. But the thing is, this is why the weekly averages and more so the monthly trends are way more valuable than looking at the individual weigh-ins, because those individual weigh-ins literally don't matter. If I was to weigh myself on just random days throughout the week and not have any structure behind it, it would completely mess with my head. And I'm going to give you an example of this. Just last week, I saw 141.2 on the scale one day, which, if I was starting off, I told you I started off, my weekly average for the first week was 144, 143.8. Last week, 8 weeks later, I saw 141.2 one day. That's a small difference, right? That's like 3 pounds or 2.5 pounds. But because I'm looking at my weekly average, right, over the course of the last few months, I'm not down 3 pounds. I'm down almost 5.5 pounds. That might not sound like a huge difference, but for me and for my body composition, for my size, that is a big difference. So the reason that I'm kind of talking through this and giving you kind of the full breakdown of this is because one, the scale is just one metric. If you use the scale to dictate how things are going throughout a fat loss phase, if you only use the scale, and if you're doing it at random times, like if you're just weighing yourself at random times throughout the week and you're not taking into account any averages or any trends, then you're going to completely mess with your head. You're going to make things a lot harder for yourself, and it's not going to show the true accuracy of what's going on, right? So the scale is one metric. And with that kind of, when I mentioned the goal was to lose on average about 0.5 to 0.75% of my body weight per week, that was just a goal that we extrapolate over a period of time. So even though I had a weekly goal of that, it's not that I was losing. I absolutely didn't lose that amount week to week. But when I look back after a month and 2 months, I'm right around where I want to be. I'm on the lower end of that, but that's what I want. So again, the scale is not the end all be all, and there's so many different factors that play into that number that shows up on a daily basis. So all that being said, I'm not going to continue to ramble on about the scale, but it's just one metric, and you need to make sure that you're using it strategically, and you need to make sure that it's not affecting how you approach your day, right? And when I say that, I mean, when you wake up in the morning, and if you are weighing yourself every single morning, the number on the scale should not have any effect on how you go about your day. You should be continuing to follow the plan that you've planned out at the beginning of the week. That scale number does not dictate anything. It's just a data point. And if you let it dictate more than just being a data point in the grand scheme of things, then I promise you are making your life a lot harder for yourself when you're in a fat loss phase. The scale is a metric. Is one metric. It should be used as looking at data over time, trends over time, not one specific weigh-in. Okay, I'm going to leave that behind for now. So in terms of the scale, that's kind of what's been going on. And then measurements, I've obviously been taking body tape measurements every single week. Those were a little bit sticky in the beginning, but then I did see, I have over the past, I would say 4 to 5 weeks, continuous drops on a weekly basis. And then also just, I'm feeling really good. Like over the last, even with the scale kind of not moving, I would say like back 3 to 4 weeks ago, it was like kind of stagnant. Things weren't moving. I was feeling good. Like my clothes were fitting better. I was feeling leaner. My energy was like, everything was just feeling good. And I knew I was just making progress based off how I was feeling and how I was feeling and fitting in my clothes and just overall. So again, the scale is not the end all be all. Measurements are not even the end all be all. They're all just metrics and data points that we need to use in combination with everything else. So again, that's just something that I wanted to point out because I feel like it's something that a lot of my clients get caught up on. If the scale's not moving, they want to, get more aggressive right away, but you have to be patient. And I'm going to talk about that in a second too, because I got a question on it. Okay. So jumping into a few other metrics. So in terms of like my steps and my movement, I bumped these up quite a bit from when I started. So I went from averaging around 8 to 9K steps before the cut started. And then about a week in, I think we bumped up to about 10 to 11K. And then the past like 4-ish weeks, I've been pushing up to around 12 to 13K, which is pretty high for me and for my lifestyle. I think steps are just overall movement is just so underrated especially when it comes to fat loss. It's something that I've realized myself over the past few years, and it is very beneficial, and it can help it can help over time. It might not seem like it's a huge bump when I say 11 to 12 or 11 to 13K, but over time that adds up. And I'm going to talk about this in a second as well when I get into another question. But that's where kind of my movement's at. Performance in the gym. So overall, I've been feeling really good. I did have a few moments in the beginning, I would say between like weeks 2 and 3, where I did notice my energy levels kind of dipped a little bit. And that's normal, going into a deficit and kind of getting into the groove of things. It's normal for energy levels to dip. So that, it dipped kind of, I would say around weeks 2 and 3. And then, my body kind of adapted to it, and it's been fine ever since. I've been feeling actually really, really good in the gym, been feeling really good energy wise. No issues there, no issues with sleep. In terms of like hunger and cravings, again, those were elevated a little bit in the first few weeks. But I'm not having any issues now outside of, the normal hunger pangs that come with being in a deficit or being in a cut, which is absolutely normal. Like being in a cut or being in a fat loss phase, you will experience hunger. It's part of it. You're literally consuming less calories, and obviously you're in a deficit. So your body reacts in some sense, and that comes with hunger and things like that. So you will notice, if you don't notice any hunger and you are in a fat loss phase, then I would say that's not normal. You should have some hunger pangs at some points. It's just part of the process. You don't want to be like hungry every single day, all day, but there should be a little bit of hunger there at times. But again, your body will also adapt, right? So the first few weeks, like I mentioned, like the first 2-3 weeks, I did have some hunger pangs that were a little bit higher than they are, moving past that 3-week mark, because my body adapted to that. My body adapted to the energy deficit, and same with energy levels. I kind of adapted to that. And yeah, it's been pretty good. So I would say over the last, I guess 5-ish, 6 weeks, it's been kind of smooth sailing. But yeah, I want to get into, that's kind of the overall update. I do want to get into some specific questions that I got from my Instagram story. And then within these questions, I'll be getting into more details as well, within the cut. So let's get into those questions. The first question is a general question: how long should a cut last? Okay, this is a great question. I think I've talked about this a little bit in the past, but there's really no one answer to this question because it's highly individual on the person. It all depends where you're starting, where you're looking to go, how much you have to lose, how aggressive you want to get, what fits within your lifestyle at the point in time that you're going into a cut. Like, for example, are you traveling a lot? Are you going on vacations? That's going to play into kind of how you structure your fat loss phase, whether you're taking, more breaks than not. So there's so many different kind of, it depends to this question, but I would say in general, a general timeline that I like to stick to for most of my clients and with myself is anywhere from like 12 to 24 weeks would be a general timeline for a fat loss phase. 12 weeks would probably be the minimum. That's where you're going to be getting a little bit more aggressive, probably. And when I say more aggressive, I mean, probably taking less breaks or less diet breaks, less refeeds. And then 24 weeks would be kind of the max that I would recommend for a fat loss phase. And that would be more with taking adequate breaks along the way. not weekly diet breaks, but taking a few weeks at maintenance or in a diet break, because that's 24 weeks is 6 months, right? So that's a long period of time. So within a cut like that, you definitely want to be taking breaks along the way. You want to be, implementing diet breaks, refeeds, things like that. And then after that 24 weeks is up, I always recommend, spending a good chunk of time at maintenance before going back into a fat loss phase if needed. So again, it all depends where you're starting off at. So if you're someone who has a lot of weight to lose, then I would say that you're probably going to, obviously that's going to take a little bit longer. But that would be more so be that like 24 weeks where we're taking breaks in between. And then maybe we take like a 4 or 6 week maintenance phase before diving back into another fat loss phase if you do have more to lose after that. If you're someone who doesn't have a lot to lose, then more so towards that 12 to like 16 weeks is probably going to be what I recommend, or at least what I bring my clients through. And then in terms of more aggressive with that, I would say the only time I would get more aggressive, under that 12-week mark would be if we're implementing a mini cut, which is a completely different scenario. That would be like a super aggressive dieting phase, which lasts like anywhere between 4 and 6 weeks. But that's mostly mini cuts. And for what I recommend, mini cuts generally are recommended during a building phase or for a very specific scenario. But I actually did record an episode all about mini cuts, what they are, why you would implement them, when you would implement them, and how to implement them. So I'm going to link that episode in the show notes. If you are interested in mini cuts, you can go and listen to that after you finish listening to this episode. It's episode 76, and it's titled Mini Cuts, What, Why, When, and How. Again, I'll link that in the show notes. So that's the general answer. And then another person also asked, how long is your cut, and are you using refeeds and diet breaks, and how often? So the question I just answered before was how long should a cut last, which was a general question. This question is how long is your cut, and are you using refeeds, diet breaks, and how often? So my cut right now is planned out for a total of 16 weeks. And within those 16 weeks, I have 2 planned diet break weeks. And then I have refeeds planned as needed. Right now, like I mentioned, I take a refeed once a week where I bring my calories back up to maintenance, but the overall caloric intake for the week stays where it needs to be in that deficit. So for me, a total of, I'm probably going to be in a deficit for a total of about 12 to 14 weeks, depending on if I do implement another diet break past that 2 planned diet break weeks. So the total cut right now is planned out for that total, like I said, of 16 weeks. But within that 16 weeks, I have those 2 diet break weeks. So that brings me down to 14. I'm probably going to incorporate another maybe 3 to 4 day kind of refeed / diet break where I do bring calories back up to maintenance. So that'll bring me back probably down to like 12-ish, 13 weeks. So I'm going to actually be in a deficit between that 12 and 13 week mark, although the actual cut lasts 16 weeks. So hopefully that makes sense. And then in terms of the diet break, so I did take a diet break at Easter. And that was I think that was the 4th week into my cut. So that's why I mentioned before, I'm 9 weeks in now, but I'm technically only 8 weeks in the deficit because I did take that diet break at Easter because it just worked out with my schedule. I like to always implement diet breaks for myself and for my clients when it's most convenient and makes the most sense. And that's usually implementing them around holidays or vacations or travel when it's harder to stick within, the normal everyday routine that you're in, right? So it makes sense to just incorporate them there. And so that's what I did. And then I'm also taking about a 10-day diet break, actually. So it's a little bit more than a week over Memorial Day. And then into the next week when I go on vacation in Hawaii, it's also my birthday. So I have like a 10-day period where I'm going to be traveling, and it's a vacation, it's my birthday, all of that. So definitely implementing a diet break then, just going to bring calories back up to maintenance. Probably when I'm on vacation in Hawaii for that 5 to 6 days, I'll probably be tracking very loosely. I intend to just enjoy myself, obviously not go off the go off the deep end because I'm still going to be in my fat loss phase, but I definitely will enjoy myself and take advantage of being at that maintenance intake for a while. And the cool thing about diet breaks is that they're not a step backwards at all. So a diet break is part of the plan. It's part of the process. You're bringing calories back up to around your maintenance intake, and you're kind of just taking a pause. You're taking a pause in the diet. You're not gaining back a ton of weight. You're not gaining a ton of fat. You're just pausing for a period of time. And this is important to realize because some people kind of get scared of taking diet breaks. And I think they're important because they're important to kind of, practice maintenance, give you a break psychologically and physically from the diet itself. It can be super, super beneficial. And again, during a diet break, you don't want to be going off the bandwagon, but you are, having a little bit more flexibility and giving yourself some time to enjoy, your vacation or whatever it may be. So just something to keep in mind if you've never implemented a diet break before during a fat loss phase. So that's kind of my plan in that sense. And then with the refeeds, like I said, those right now I have a refeed set up one time per week as desired. So this again is what fits my personal lifestyle because like I said, I like to go out to dinner on Saturdays, try new restaurants. I've done this every single weekend on this cut. I've gone out to restaurants. I've had meals that have not been tracked super diligently because obviously if you're going out to restaurants, you don't know exactly what's in it. But I make guesstimates and I make it work and I don't stress about it. And I've been doing it every single weekend for the last 8 to 9 weeks. And I've made the great progress and I'm at where I want to be right now in terms of where this cut is at. So that's just to say, you need to set up your weekly, the way that you set up your weekly calories and things like that, there's no magic behind it. The magic is behind the adherence, right? So what can you adhere to? For me, I love to go out to dinner on weekends. I love to have more calories to kind of play with on a Saturday. And that might mean getting a little bit more aggressive during the week when I'm in, a busy routine, when I'm working, not going out to eat and things like that. And that's what works for me. So again, it all comes back to what works for you. And it all comes back to kind of figuring that out and testing and assessing. And that's what I do with all my clients is we test things out. We see, okay, is this working? Is this not working? And then we adjust, when and if needed. So that's kind of, hopefully that answers the question. And then in terms of diet breaks and refeeds, I did record 2 episodes, one specifically on what a diet break is, how to implement it, how to implement that, and then also on refeeds as well. So I will link that episode in the show notes. It's episode 10. And then I also chatted a lot about diet breaks with Dr. Bill Campbell in another episode that we recorded, episode 45. It's called The Science of Body Recomposition. We chatted about a few other things, but we did spend a chunk of time talking about diet breaks because he has done tons of research with diet breaks. So definitely check out those 2 episodes. I will link them in the show notes if you're interested in learning more about diet breaks and refeeds. And that should answer that question. We have a few more questions here. So the next question, what's your calorie intake? Okay, so I went back and forth about, sharing this or not, and I'm actually not going to share my specific calorie intake right now or in general, because my calorie intake is not going to be your calorie intake. Everybody is different. Even if you weigh the exact same as me, even if you are the same height as me, it doesn't mean that my fat loss calories will be your fat loss calories. It doesn't work like that. There's so many different factors that play into it, specifically things like your personal dieting history, the amount of muscle mass you have, your daily movement. There's so many different things that play into how your hormones are functioning. Like all of those different things play into your calorie intake and what will work in terms of a deficit for you. And I'm not going to get into tons of things because there's tons of different avenues I can go down with that. But with all that being said, I'm not going to share my specific calorie intake because I don't want you to think that, the amount of calories that I'm consuming is what you can consume on a cut and see the same results. So with that being said, I will share what my deficit percentage is because the next question I got was, what percentage deficit are you following? And then will you drop again? So I will share this because this is kind of general. So I started at about a 15% deficit from maintenance, which is pretty much an average deficit. I would say between 10 to 20% is generally where I recommend starting off with a deficit, with 15 to 20% being probably the average with where I would start a client at. And it's a good amount. It's not too much. Anything over like a 25% deficit, I would say, is pretty aggressive. And there's generally no need to start off in such an aggressive deficit right from the start, because from past experience, just with myself and with my clients, you're kind of setting yourself up to burn out quicker than you should. So I started off at about a 15% deficit from maintenance. And as mentioned, I'm currently about 9 weeks into my cut as I'm recording this, and my coach actually just made the first calorie adjustment down last week. So the beginning of week 8, which technically would be the beginning of week 7 in a deficit, but overall beginning of week 8. And he adjusted that down by about 5%, which came out to about an 80 calorie per day drop on average. So it's been, like I said, this first adjustment was made at the beginning of week 8 of being in the fat loss phase, right? Also, don't forget that I have increased my step count quite a bit from where I was at before the cut started. So I am, getting a little bit of quote unquote extra calorie burn from just my movement overall. Rather than only relying on just getting the deficit from my calorie intake. So I've said this many times before, you should be focusing, on getting most of your deficit coming from what you put in your mouth on a daily basis. Like most of your deficit should come from what you're eating. It should come from your diet. But I think overall movement is just so underrated in a fat loss phase. And notice I said movement, not exercise. Those are two different things. Overall movement, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT, you've probably heard of, that is different than exercise or, formal exercise. They're two different things. Overall movement and steps are super, super underrated when it comes to specifically fat loss and then just health in general. I think exercise is actually overrated when it comes to fat loss. Like people are trying to out exercise, their diet. They're trying to, go do tons and tons of cardio. They're trying to use their strength training sessions and turn those into cardio sessions to get more quote unquote calorie burn. That's where the issues come. So those are two separate things. I actually talked about this in my Friday Flex newsletter last week. I chatted about how steps and movement are super underrated and why that's the case. If you're part of the Friday Flex, you've read this. If you're not, you can actually sign up for the Friday Flex. It's my weekly newsletter. I'd share just insights on the week. I share podcast episodes that have come out. I share products I'm loving, recipes, tons of just information. It's not spam or selling you anything. It's just my weekly newsletter. So if you're interested in that, if you're not signed up, you can go to metflexlife.com/newsletter and sign up for the Friday Flex. But anyway, so in that Friday Flex email last week, again, I talked about why movement is so underrated when it comes to fat loss. And really the basis is, we know that and everybody knows this, you can't, and I've said this many times, you can't outwork or out exercise a bad diet, right? But you also can't out diet a sedentary lifestyle. And that's something that a lot of people forget about, right? So you want to make it as easy as possible for yourself in your deficit, right? In your fat loss phase. And you want to see, you obviously want to see as much progress as you can get within reason. And, creating most of that deficit from your overall calorie intake, what you put in your mouth on a daily basis, is going to be the biggest thing that you can control. But you can also control your energy out in the sense of your steps, right? So your movement throughout the day. And it doesn't have to be just steps, but just making the effort to move a little bit more, go play with your kids, do some gardening, take the stairs instead of the elevator, park farther away from the grocery store, whatever it is, just being aware of that movement can be super, super beneficial. So that's something that, on top of being in the deficit, I've also increased my steps a bit. So I'm getting some extra there as well. But the biggest thing here is just realizing that, like I said, we were 8 weeks in until he made the first adjustment. And this actually gets me to the next question, which goes along, this is kind of two-part question, but somebody else asked this: how quickly do you drop calories and how low do you think you'll go in calories? So here's the thing. One of the biggest mistakes that people make and coaches make as well, if you haven't, I guess I don't want to shout out anybody, but if you are someone who hasn't been coaching for a while and you don't have the experience, this is a big mistake that I've seen. And I've seen clients come to me kind of telling me about these things that have happened with other coaches. And I've probably made these mistakes I've definitely made mistakes like this in the past when I was first starting off as a coach. But the biggest mistake that I've seen over the years is just making adjustments too quickly without assessing all the different metrics, right? So like I said, it's important to have multiple tracking metrics within your fat loss phase, not just the scale, but the scale, measurements, pictures, your overall steps and movement, your overall biofeedback, how you're feeling on a daily basis, how your sleep is, your stress, your hunger, cravings, all of these things play into the overall picture. So you need to be assessing these things, and you need to have kind of an overall idea of how these things are, progressing over the weeks, right? And after, a week on a weekly basis, actually, it's super important. And I think this is the biggest mistake I see is that people see maybe the scale jump up or, one day or even for a week, or they're not seeing progress for 1 week or even maybe 2 weeks on the scale or even with measurements. And then they're like, okay, I need to drop calories again. Right? So if you are not seeing progress for 1 week or even 2 weeks, it doesn't mean that you should just automatically drop your calories. That's not a smart approach, and it's more oftentimes not unnecessary. You have to be looking at everything. You have to be looking at the full picture. And then also, like I mentioned before, seeing the scale, bump back up one day or even a few days in a row, it's normal. Fat loss is not linear. For most everybody, I would say for 98% of people, you're not going to see a linear trend week after week after week. There's going to be, times where things drop, they're going to go back up, they're going to come back down. So you need to just be aware of this. You need to not freak out if you see the scale jump back up. Like I mentioned last week, I think it was last week or the week before, I saw that big jump back up to 141.2, I think it was. And I didn't freak out because I knew that it was probably just a little bit of water weight, maybe some extra sodium I had the day before. Typically after like a hard day in the gym, like after a hard lower body or leg day, I tend to always see the scale jump up the next day just because I'm holding on to a little bit more inflammation, a little bit more water, which is absolutely normal, right? It means I pushed hard in the gym and my body is recovering, right? It's a little bit inflamed, and that's part of the adaptation process that comes with, building muscle and maintaining muscle as well. So anyway, with all that being said, to answer this question, someone asked, the second part of the question was, how quickly do you drop calories? How long do you think you'll go, or how low do you think you'll go in calories? So again, this is all specific to the individual. So I can't, give you an exact, time frame of, oh, you should drop calories here or whatever. It's all specific to the individual. But the biggest takeaway here is that you have to be patient. You shouldn't be just dropping your calories because you didn't see progress 1 week or because you saw the scale jump up. It doesn't work like that. Fat loss is not, it's not usually a linear process, and you're going to see these fluctuations week to week. So you just need to stick out the course, stick to the plan. And if you're working with a coach, a good coach, trust what the coach is doing. And how things are going, that will dictate, the adjustments that need to be made, overall down the line. And there will need to be adjustments, right? You're probably going to have to make adjustments. Just like I mentioned, my coach made an adjustment after about 8 weeks. But there were other factors involved there too, right? So I upped my steps a little bit. Different things were happening. So with all that being said, the biggest takeaway here is just be patient. Trust that, if you're working with someone who knows what they're doing, trust that they know what they're doing. If you don't trust them, then that might mean that you need to maybe find a new coach or find a new strategy in that sense. So anyway, hopefully that answered that question. And getting on to the next question. So we have 4 more questions that I got. So the next question is, do you have any tricks during the first few days of a cut to avoid sugar cravings? Okay, this is a great question. So a few things here. The first thing, I would just focus on mainly, going into your fat loss phase, right? Focusing on foods that fill you up. If you don't know what foods fill you up, then you're going to have to spend the first 1 to 2 weeks kind of testing and assessing with that. In general, for most people, it's more higher volume foods that have higher satiety values. So like lots of protein, non-starchy veggies if you're a veggie person. Some people feel, more satiated and more full off of higher fats. Some people feel more satiated and more full off of higher carbs, right? So everybody is different. Some people, do well with, fasting a little bit, and some people don't. There's all these, everybody's so different. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but the biggest thing for point number one is just focusing on foods that fill you up, and then also kind of structuring. The next thing would be kind of structuring your overall day and your meals. To kind of have a set schedule. So if your eating is all over the place, or maybe if you're having like too small of meals throughout the day, or if you're just kind of snacking and grazing, that can actually increase hunger and cravings. So I would recommend sticking to a normal schedule, or getting on a normal schedule that works for your lifestyle, and kind of planning that out, for your week, right? So if you're someone who thrives off of, fasting a little bit in the morning, to kind of push a little bit more calories towards the end of the day, that can help with getting into that structure. But you want to get into something that is more structured, right? You don't want to be like having random meal times throughout the day, just because that has been shown to increase hunger and cravings. So that could help, just making sure that you have some plan and some structure behind that. That would be the second thing. Then the next thing would just be getting trigger foods out of the house. So any of the foods that trigger you, if they're highly palatable, they have sugar in them, or even if they don't have sugar in them, but they're highly palatable. Maybe if they're if you're following a lower carb diet, you might have a ton of quote unquote low carb or keto snacks in your pantry that are highly palatable. And even if they don't have carbs or sugar in them, they still cause you to overeat, right? So that's something to be aware of. If they're trigger foods, and when I say trigger food, I mean something that, is in your cabinet, it's there, it's kind of, calling your name, right? Versus if it wasn't there, right? If you set your kind of environment up so that you weren't kind of tempted on a daily basis, then you're putting yourself in a much more advantageous position to not kind of overconsume these highly palatable foods, and to stay away from maybe the sugary foods or whatever it may be. So that's another point, just getting the trigger foods out of the house, or getting those highly palatable foods out of the house that tend to cause you to want to eat more of them. So that's a big thing that can help with cutting down on those cravings. Another thing would be making it a point to just drink a lot of water, especially first starting out. Just be aware of that, track your water intake, stock up on seltzer waters, 0-calorie bubbly drinks. I think one of my addictions is probably seltzer water. I drink, especially in a fat loss phase, that helps me to just kind of keep my mind off of food. I have some seltzer waters, probably have 3 or 4 seltzers a day. Some are flavor drinks like LaCroix, or I just have plain sparkling water, or some of those the Zevia drinks, which have a little bit of flavor. So again, it's just all finding what kind of helps you to adhere during the day, and kind of maybe if you are struggling with sugar cravings, you can implement these things to kind of help with that and stave off those cravings. And then another thing, the last thing I would say is hunger hacks. That's a big thing that I always talk about, is having hunger hacks on hand. If you don't know what a hunger hack is, it's exactly what it says. It's a hack to hack your hunger and your cravings. And it's basically typically a higher volume, very low calorie food or drink or whatever it is that you can consume that kind of allows you to get past that craving. So for me, things like electrolyte jello, electrolyte gummies, protein ice cream, those are very high volume, low calorie foods. I actually have a free ebook on my website that's called, it's literally called Hunger Hacks. So if you go to my website, metflexlife.com, you can actually download that Hunger Hacks ebook. It's free, it has a bunch of recipes that I implement specifically within a fat loss phase, and that could potentially help you. So head over to metflexlife.com if you haven't downloaded that already. So those would be my tips on helping to kind of stave off some cravings as you begin a cut. All right, I have 3 more questions. So the next question is, have you lost muscle while cutting? So I hope not. But I am doing everything I can to mitigate this as much as possible. However, there is going to be some muscle loss in a fat loss phase. For most everybody, you're going to experience a little bit of muscle loss. This is inevitable in most everyone, I would say. Just like it's inevitable, if you go into a surplus and you're building muscle, it's inevitable that you will have some fat gain come along with that, unless you're a freak of nature and you can just build a ton of muscle and not put on any fat, which there are some people out there, but definitely not me, definitely not most of the clients I work with. It's the same idea in a fat loss phase. Obviously, you want to be, focused on losing, or not focused, but you want to be obviously doing whatever you can to hold on to as much muscle as possible and lose the body fat, not the muscle, but you will lose a little bit of muscle. It's kind of just part of the process. But with that being said, there are a few things that you can do to make sure that you're holding on to as much muscle as possible during a fat loss phase. So a few tips. The first one would be making sure, and I talk about these all the time, but making sure that you're keeping your protein high and that you're paying attention to your protein feedings throughout the day so that you can be stimulating muscle protein synthesis multiple times throughout the day. So I actually just recorded an entire episode all about this. It's episode 111, so episode 111. I will link it in the show notes, but the title is How to Optimize Protein Intake and Distribution Across Your Day to Maximize Gains. I'll link that in the show notes. If you haven't listened to that already, it goes deep into why it's important to have multiple protein feedings throughout the day, especially if your goal is to not only maximize muscle growth, but to minimize muscle loss and to hold on to maintain as much muscle as possible in a fat loss phase. So check out that episode if you haven't after you finish listening to this one. The next tip would be resistance train like you would if you were not in a cut. This is something that I've talked about in the past, but you don't want to be necessarily changing up your training, especially when it comes to resistance training, so much when you go into a cut. You should be pushing yourself to, continue to, lift as heavy as you can, continue to progressively overload, continue to push yourself in the gym. Obviously, there's going to be some days where energy is going to be a little bit lower. You might not see, tons of muscle growth, within a fat loss phase, especially if you're advanced, but you want to do everything you can to continue to send the signal to your muscles and to your body that they're being used and that you need them, right? So if you continue to send that signal, your body's going to continue to say, oh, okay, I need this. I need this muscle. I'm going to hold on to it as much as I can, especially in this fat loss phase. So more of the story is just continue to resistance train like you would if you were not in a cut. Put as much effort towards it as you can. That will allow you to hold on to as much muscle as possible. And again, it'll continue to send that signal to your body that says, hey, don't take this muscle, take the body fat, right? So that would be another tip. Another thing would be mindful of your fasting protocol. So this is something that I've made mistakes in the past, especially when it comes to fasting and being in a fat loss phase. I talk a little bit about this in that episode that I recorded on protein, but I also recorded another episode 107. It's titled Fasting and Muscle Preservation. And then there's some other things that are within that episode as well, but I will link that in the show notes where I talk all about fasting and muscle preservation and why it's important to be aware and be mindful of your fasting protocol, especially in a fat loss phase, especially if your goal is to hold on to as much muscle as possible. And then also if you are on the leaner side and you are going into a fat loss phase, this becomes even more important. So you just want to be mindful of your overall fasting protocol. I'm not going to get into too many specifics there because I did record that episode on it. But that's another thing to just be aware of in terms of preserving as much muscle as possible. The next two things I would say are pay attention to recovery. So if I said before, you should be resistance training like you were if you weren't in a cut. That doesn't mean that you should be overtraining, right? So you have to find a balance there. If you're, pushing yourself to failure every single session of your resistance training session, you're going to burn out, right? You're going to be overtraining. You're not going to be recovering properly. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you should push yourself as much as you can, but you also have to kind of gauge where you're at. especially, week to week, right? As you get deeper into the deficit, you might notice that, energy levels kind of fall off a little bit. You might notice that you're losing a little bit of strength. That those things are normal, but we do want to mitigate them as much as possible. So the biggest thing here is paying attention to your recovery, right? So stop overtraining, stop neglecting your sleep. Sleep is a huge, huge piece of the fat loss puzzle. Just along with movement, overall steps, sleep is something that a lot of people, do not pay attention to. And I would say it's another very, very underrated aspect of being in a fat loss phase. So for me specifically, I, especially within this fat loss phase, I've been prioritizing sleep as much as I can, sleeping a little bit later than probably I normally would. But it's something that I find to be very, very beneficial. And I think for everybody, they should be optimizing their sleep as much as possible, no matter where you're at in your journey, but especially in a fat loss phase, and then also in a muscle gain phase as well, or building phase, because we know that sleep is where we recover most. And we know that our muscles are not built in the gym. They're broken down in the gym. Our muscles are built during our recovery. And that's important in a fat loss phase because we want to be, again, maintaining as much muscle as possible. So sleeping, stress management techniques, making sure you are fueling appropriately. So like I said, keeping protein high, not going into a super, super aggressive deficit where you are not having adequate fuel coming in, because that's going to be a recipe for disaster and a recipe for muscle loss. So you have to find a balance there. And then lastly, I would say be strategic with your cardio. And when I say cardio, I'm separating cardio from general movement. Obviously, you should be strategic with your overall movement, like I just talked about before, how that's very underrated. But cardio, I would say I'm more referring to being strategic with your formal cardio, and this would fall under that exercise portion. So being strategic with your cardio is going to be important as well for maintaining muscle mass. If you're, trying to be a cardio bunny every single day and spending, hours on the treadmill, or, running and getting on the step mill for every single day, like that's probably not a great approach, especially in the beginning of a fat loss phase. You're going to burn out quickly. You're going to adapt to that cardio very quickly, and you won't have any runway as you continue on in your fat loss phase. So we need, we want to start off, I would say, in the most conservative way that you can, because when I say the most conservative, really what I'm saying is that you want to be doing enough to see the progress that you've anticipated and to be on track for where you want to go, but you don't want to be doing too much where you burn out after 3 weeks, or where you implement tons of cardio and then you have nowhere to go 8 weeks down the line, or whatever it may be. So being strategic about your cardio is also important, not just in the fat loss phase, but also with, this general question of maintaining muscle. So I did record a podcast that jumped all into cardio. It's episode 56. It's called Clearing Up the Cardio Confusion, Implementing Cardio for Fat Loss Performance and Overall Health. So if you haven't listened to that one, or if it's been a while, I will link that one in the show notes as well. You can go listen to that one after you finish listening to this episode. Tons of episodes, or tons of previous episodes are being linked in the show notes, like I mentioned, but they all have value to them, and specifically within these questions that I got. So I figured it'd make sense to link all of those if you're interested. All right, 2 more questions, and these are quick ones that I'll get through. Okay, the next one is, will you reverse diet after the cut is over, or stay at new maintenance for a while? Okay, this is a good question. So personally, I don't anticipate my maintenance being too much lower than when I started, because I'm not going to be losing probably more than 10 pounds on this cut. I'm not saying that 10 pounds is like a magic number or anything, but from my past cuts, I've been able to, and within my past cuts, I haven't generally lost, at least the last cut, I haven't generally lost more than 10 pounds. My first cut, like 3.5, 4 years ago, I did lose 20 pounds. So my maintenance did come, is a little bit lower now than it was, 3 years ago. That's just because I have a smaller body, a smaller frame, and that's really what makes the most difference. So when this person asked, will you reverse diet or stay at your new maintenance? When they say new maintenance, they're referring to, this is something that I've talked about in the past. If you go on a diet, and if you are someone who, loses a good amount of weight, right? So if you start off at whatever, a certain weight, and say you lose 40 pounds over the course of a diet, your maintenance intake that you were consuming 40 pounds ago, like when you were 40 pounds heavier, is probably not going to be the same maintenance as you are right now, because you're just physically a smaller person, right? So it physically takes less energy to move around a smaller body. So your overall calories that you consumed when you were 40 pounds heavier, is probably going to be a little bit more than it is 40 pounds lighter. So again, 40 pounds is not a magic number either. That's just an example. But overall, I don't see my maintenance being drastically different at all than it was when I started the cut. So I will implement some sort of reverse, but it's not going to be like a slow reverse. I'm probably going to jump up to about 70 to 80% of my maintenance intake and kind of see how my body responds over the course of a few weeks, and then continue to titrate back up within a few weeks to my overall maintenance. And from past experience, that's worked well for me. I've at least over the last 2 years and over my last cut, like I was able to get back to maintenance pretty quickly and not gain the weight back. That's something that, that's something to be aware of too, right? The calories that you're consuming in your fat loss phase and in your deficit should not be the same calories that you are staying at forever, right? Because you're literally in a deficit. You're literally consuming under the amount of calories that you need to maintain your weight. So after you finish the cut or the fat loss phase, you have to figure out, okay, what is my maintenance intake now? What can I consume to maintain my weight and to maintain my results and my fat loss results, if that's your goal. And that for most people, that takes kind of, going through a reverse diet. And there's different ways to go about that. I actually record a podcast all about reverse dieting and how I take my clients through that. And kind of the different ways that you can go about versus like a slow reverse diet versus, like I said, bumping back up to about 70 to 80% of your maintenance and moving from there. So with all that being said, for myself, like I said, I'm going to bump back up pretty quickly probably, and then kind of just assess how I'm doing for a few weeks, and then be at maintenance for a while. And that actually brings me into the last question, which was, can you talk about how your cut fits into your overall plan or goals for next year? So I love this question because I love to talk about long-term periodization. I think it's super important, and it's something that I make sure is a priority. When I'm working with my one-on-one clients, we always plan out like ahead of time. We look at the next, 6 months to 12 months and say, okay, what are your goals? Where do you want to be in 6 months from now? Where do you want to be in 12 months from now? And then let's reverse engineer from there. I think periodization is such a big piece of the puzzle when it comes to overall, reaching your goals, but then also maintaining your goals down the line, especially when it comes to fat loss and things like that. Like you can't just, go on a diet and then just diet forever until you, quote unquote, reach your goal. That's typically a recipe for frustration. So if you can have a set plan, right? And we talked about this kind of going back to the beginning of this episode. The first question was, how long should a cut be? And I said, between 12 and 24 weeks is the typical amount, with 24 weeks kind of being the max. That's for a reason, because even if you do have a good amount of weight to lose, and even if it's going to take you more than 24 weeks, which if you have a lot to lose, it probably will, it doesn't mean that you should be dieting until you can't anymore, right? Because it's a recipe for burnout. You have to be strategic with where you're at. You have to be strategic with implementing breaks and periods of maintenance and things like that. So anyway, this just kind of, I'm going off on a tangent here, but having a plan long-term is very important. And then being able to kind of reverse engineer from there is super beneficial, not just with dieting, but also, or not just with nutrition, but with training and with everything in life, really. So anyway, to answer this question, I'm actually still in the process of thinking about my long-term goals. I'm actually doing that right now in terms of goals for 2022, specifically, what I wanted, where I see myself at a year from now. I'm still kind of thinking through that, and it's been something that I've been taking my time to think about over the past month strategically. So my plan after the cut is to pretty much hang out at maintenance for a while, and then potentially go into another building phase, maybe early 2022. Like I said, I just came off of an 8-month building phase. Before that, I was in a maintenance phase for a little while, and then I'd done a cut before that. So after this cut, I really just want to spend some time at maintenance. I think maintenance is also a very underrated part of overall periodization, right? Spending time at maintenance. You're not just becoming lazy because you don't have a goal to shoot for, right? Maintenance is a goal, right? Spending time maintaining what you've just spent, months getting to is important. And I think, we know that the biggest drawback of like kind of the industry and the weight loss industry isn't losing the weight, right? And when I say drawback, I mean mostly the biggest issue is that the issue isn't generally losing the weight for most people, it's maintaining that weight loss afterwards. So I think maintenance is an even harder part of the overall fat loss process. And so that's something that, with my clients, it's something that we practice, after the fat loss phase. We practice maintenance. There's so much that needs to be done within a maintenance phase, building habits, building structure, and maintaining the things that you've built over the past within your fat loss phase, and kind of carrying those over and seeing how those work into a maintenance phase. And yeah, just overall practicing maintenance. It's not the sexiest part of a periodization plan, but it's absolutely necessary. And I think it's one of the most underrated parts of it. So I will be spending some time at maintenance. And then, I'm going to be thinking more about my goals, and it's still something that I'm going to be thinking about over the coming weeks. And I will keep you posted as I, figure it out a little bit more. But overall, through the rest of the year, like I mentioned, just going to be maintaining and then potentially go into another building phase in 2022. But we'll see where things are at. All right. So that is all I have for you today. Those were the questions. They're great questions. Thank you so much for asking them. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, if you took something away from it, please make sure to share it out on, wherever you want. Specifically, if you have an Instagram, it would be really great if you could take a screenshot of this episode right now on your phone, and you can share it to your Instagram story. Tag me. I'm at rachgregory.cns. I will repost it, share it out. Thank you for listening to the show. And that also helps spread the word and get people interested in it. And then also, if you know anybody who would benefit from, this episode specifically, or any of the other episodes that I referenced in this podcast, please make sure to share it out with them as well. All of my podcast episodes are on all podcast platforms. Also on my website, metflexlife.com. If you go to the menu bar on the top right corner, it's a drop down, and you'll see there's a podcast category. All of the podcasts with all the show notes are up on that, in that category. So you can click there as well and share that out. And then if you're not signed up for my Friday Flex newsletter, again, you can go to metflexlife.com/newsletter and sign up for that. And you'll be on the list to get the Friday Flex. All right. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I will chat with you next time.